So now I want to pivot back in Module 8 to what's taking place in the United States at the end of the 19 teens and then 1920s. We spent a lot of time in Module 7 trying to understand, by reading about Wilson, by reading about World War I, by reading through Rousseau and Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, just what made the European experience tick. But now you've got to understand something very important about the American experience in the 19 teens and 20s. Think of yourself having been an American soldier. You live in a great continent with abundant natural resources that has everything going for it. You have a natural tendency to be optimistic about the continent that you live in. Well, why? Because time and time again, and we saw this after the Civil War, Americans do what? Well, they pick themselves up, they invent a new patent, they find something new to do, and they just go about doing it. So instead of kind of worrying about civilization or God is dead or this, that, and the other, give an American something to do, they'll do it, they'll work it, they'll make it that much better, and then go forward. So that's kind of the capturing and part of the American spirit. And this was true after World War I. We come away from our experience dealing with World War I saying, we want to do what? We want to return to normalcy. It's not a normalcy of European intellectual culture. It's a normalcy of just small town American life lived as it should be, where simple rules rule, where the business of the American people is business. So how does this play out in this module? Well, I want to introduce you to this notion. I've given you different paradigms throughout this course, but I want to introduce you to a new paradigm. And that new paradigm is something that I would call the philosophy of history. Broadly speaking, what philosophy of history permeates the American experience, and how is the American, by and large, American philosophy of history different than the one that we see at play in European intellectual thought? So I want to compare two philosophies of history. The first philosophy of history is what I would call a progressive philosophy of history. And what it suggests is the following. When man first came into this world, it started off in a low and savage place. But over time, as our mind expands, as our thoughts expand, as reason and our understanding of human experience expands, we grow better and better and better, so that the course of human history is moving in a progressive direction. I told you that after the Civil War, there were different isms that defined America's intellectual experience. I said, you have Romanticism. So what is Romanticism? By and large, it suggests what? That a new world can be created by man. It's progressive. And that's exactly what happens after you move from Romanticism to pragmatism to progressivism and imperialism. That American state of mind believes there's nothing beyond our power in making the world a better place. But there's a second philosophy of history, and we saw this at play in Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. It's what I would call a declinist view or philosophy of history. A Marx, a Rousseau, a Nietzsche, and a Freud, what do they point to as being the high point of humanity? They point to the savage. They point to man in his original state, unencumbered by civilization, willing himself. Now, he may not have the resources, and he may not have the art and architecture of Western civilization as it makes its way forward, but he knows existence, right? And he lives out an existence. But over time, these European thinkers believe what? That man's life has gone further and further downhill. That civilization amounts to a downward spiral of the human experience that can only be reversed if what? If we wake up in the modern world in the 20th century and we get reignited by some grand passion to do something grand. So an American experience that's kind of moderate, progressive, incrementally moving forward, and the European declinist perspective that requires some kind of catastrophic break with civilization to then make things right. Well, the Americans look at the way that these Europeans look at the world, and they're like, it's crazy. Why can't we just enjoy the world as it is? Why can't we just enjoy our little Arcadian slice of it? So this notion of America as the last Arcadia in the world, a place where peace and quiet and commerce and business and common sense can rule the day, is a place that wins over the idea of many Americans, so much so that they're like, Europeans, we want no part of your history. We're going to return onto our continent, and we're going to live out that Arcadian existence. My question for you is, when we read Calvin Coolidge, and we read Herbert Hoover, and we read the novel that will end this module, The Great Gatsby, is it possible for Americans to enjoy a last Arcadia? To answer that question correctly, we have to ask ourselves, well, does American life in the 19-teens and the 1920s actually amount to an Arcadian experience, or are we fooling ourselves believing that we can live a different life than the rest of the world?